Thank you so much, Sonia. I don't know about you, but I really love peanut butter. I mean, really love peanut butter. And I guess in truth, all my life I have. But even as an adult, I probably eat more peanut butter and jelly sandwiches than the average child. And I've always loved it. And for years, I just thought peanut butter was peanut butter. It didn't make any difference. The brand peanut butter is peanut butter. You know, creamy or crunchy, that's kind of the varieties. But, you know, all the brands are essentially the same. And I thought that, and I felt that that was true until I discovered one day, I was in the grocery store. I might have even been single at this point. It's been quite a number of years ago. But I was in the grocery store, and I saw that they had this new variety, this new flavor of peanut butter. It was Peter Pan Honey Roasted Peanut Butter. If something's good in the first place, add sugar to it. It's even better, right? And so I thought, you know, it's worth a shot. And so I bought some of this peanut butter, and the next day or two, I went to open it to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, and I spread it out just like everything else. And I noticed also it goes on like silk. And then I tasted it, and angels began to sing. It really is absolutely delicious. Now, you may say Jif, you may say Skippy, or whatever your brand is, or the Harris Teeter brand, or the Food Line brand, or the Walmart brand. I'm telling you, none of those brands compare to Peter Pan Honey Roasted Peanut Butter. And so I began to buy this stuff, especially if and when it went on sale. I would really stock up on this stuff. And I just loved it. And I was eating it probably 3, 4, maybe 5 times a week. And so all was going well until, and maybe you remember this, a number of years ago, there was this recall of Peter Pan peanut butter, including the honey roasted. And it was something silly like, I don't know, salmonella, I don't know. So there was this giant recall, and so all the stores pulled the Peter Pan peanut butter, and the news stations, newspapers, they all reported this range of serial numbers, and they wanted people to look in their cupboards, look in their pantries, see if you have any that's in this serial number range. And if you do, take it to the grocery store and they'll refund your money. And so just to give you an idea of how much of this stuff I was using, I went to our pantry and looked. I took back 8 jars to Food Line. And so I get my money back, and I just anticipated, okay, this salmonella thing, they'll clean their machines, it'll be a couple of weeks, and, you know, it'll be back in the stores. Well, a couple of weeks pass, and still there's no Peter Pan peanut butter. Weeks continue to add up. They turn into months. Multiplied months pass, and I can't tell you, I felt like a little kid on Christmas morning looking at an empty Christmas tree. I'd go to the peanut butter aisle in the grocery store, and the Peter Pan section is completely bare. And then one day, my friend returned. And I was just so elated, so thrilled that this peanut butter had shown back up, because it is absolutely the best. I would encourage you, on your way home, stop. Get a jar of Peter Pan Honey Roasted Peanut Butter. Why? Because it's that good. It's that much better. It's that different. It's that different. You know, I believe this to be true, and I believe it unfortunately to be true, that there are a lot of people that profess to be or identify themselves as being a follower of Jesus, saying that they are a Christian, and though they would never say this with their words, consistently they communicate through their actions that being a Christian or becoming a Christian involves little more than a name change. I once was lost, but now I'm found, was blind, but now I see. Used to be unsaved, now I'm saved. I used to be a non-Christian, and now I'm a Christian. It's a technical distinction. But the truth is, what our world needs, and quite frankly, what God expects, is to find people that become His followers where there's an entirely more marked difference than a name change. God expects us as His followers, if we are His followers, that our lives are markedly different than those that are around us. Markedly different than those that have yet to make a decision to follow Jesus. But here's our question for this morning. Why is it that we are to be so different? Why is it that we are to be so different? Peter answers that question for us today in 1 Peter chapter 4. If you would look with me in your Bibles there this morning, and we're going to pick up with verse 1, go down through verse 6 as we're continuing to make our way through this letter. 1 Peter chapter 4, beginning with verse 1. Peter starts by saying, "Therefore, since Christ suffered for us in the flesh, arm yourselves also with the same mind. For he who has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin, that he no longer should live the rest of his time in the flesh for the lusts of men, but for the will of God. For we've spent enough of our past lifetime in doing the will of the Gentiles, when we walked in lewdness, lusts, drunkenness, revelries, drinking parties, and abominable idolatries. In regard to these, they think it strange that you do not run with them in the same flood of dissipation, speaking evil of you. They will give an account to him who is ready to judge the living and the dead. For this reason, the gospel was preached also to those who are dead, that they might be judged according to men in the flesh, but live according to God in the Spirit." Peter's talking to first century followers of Jesus, and he's showing them, and because we still have these words, God through Peter's words is showing us why our lives are to be so different. And the first reason that he communicates is this: our lives are to be so different because we follow a different model. Because we follow a different model. Now, verse 1 begins with a transitional term, a linking term, the word therefore. Obviously, that links what he is saying presently to what he's just been talking about. Well, what has he just been talking about? Well, you see this back at the end of verse 22, or through the end of chapter 3, that he's talking about the sufferings of Jesus. And with the sufferings of Jesus, with that in mind, therefore, Peter begins to talk about the sufferings of us. Our sufferings, our oppositions that we experience as followers of Jesus. Now keep in mind as to what is going on for these first century Christians, these early believers in Peter's day. Things are very difficult at this point. There is outright governmental dictated oppression and persecution of Christians. So the Roman government is actively and openly persecuting and is openly hostile to Christians. And as if that were not bad enough, you have this Jewish community out of which many of these people came that is not simply ostracizing, but they are likewise persecuting these early Christians. Things are really tough. It's costing these people to be a follower of Jesus. But it seems that Peter is aware, and correctly aware, that as bad as things were, it's going to be getting worse. And so with that type of suffering and with that type of opposition in view, Peter is writing these words to come as an encouragement to them, to stand strong, to remain strong, trying to pat them on the back, to say, listen, what you have been enduring, it may get worse, but you can continue to stand and stand firm in your commitment and your relationship to Jesus. And what he says helps make that possible. So he's just been talking about the sufferings of Jesus, and then he goes to verse 1 of chapter 4, and he says, "Therefore, since Christ suffered for us in the flesh, arm yourselves or guard yourselves with the same mind." Now, what he's talking about is very simple. We talked about this a couple of weeks ago. When he says to arm or guard yourselves with the same mind, he's referencing a very simple reality, which is this: Jesus suffered, and Jesus was persecuted. If you're going to follow him, and if you're going to try to live your life in keeping with his example, then what he experienced, that's going to become your lot as well. And not simply following him, but increasingly the measure to which you try to live your life like Jesus, the more you're going to experience and the more you're going to share in what Jesus experienced. So he's saying, guard yourselves, arm yourselves with this same mind. Have the same mentality of Jesus. Do not be surprised when suffering comes your way. And then he says, for he who has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin. He who has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin. Now, understand, first of all, what Peter is not saying. He is not communicating that if you experience any measure of opposition, any measure of persecution because of your commitment to Jesus, that you have somehow achieved and obtained a measure of sinless perfection. That hasn't happened. That's not going to happen. But it does mean this. If you, in your pursuit of following Jesus and trying to pattern your life after his example, if you are doing so in such a way that it causes people to oppose you because of your commitment to him, That's indicative of the fact that sin isn't reigning in your life. That it's not controlling you, it's not that you're perfect, that you never stumble, that you never fall, that you never commit a sin, but it is communicating that as a rule, you're keeping these things in check. That you are so serious about your commitment to Jesus that you are therefore following His example to the degree that people are doing to you some of the same things that they did to Him. How does this come as an encouragement? Well, He's saying, if the going gets tough for you as a follower of Jesus, if people ridicule you, if they ostracize you, certainly there are places in the world where it could result in your imprisonment, maybe even your martyrdom. Regardless of the particulars, if you experience any opposition for your commitment to Jesus, He's saying you're in good company because you're modeling yourself after Him. And what He experienced, you too are experiencing. And the point very simply is this, that as a believer, as one that says that you follow Jesus, your life ought to be markedly different. Drastically different because you're following a different model. You're following Jesus Himself. You probably remember, even if it's been more than a few years, what it was like growing up as a child, being the object of some measure of ridicule. Even the coolest person here had something that people made fun of them for because, unfortunately, that's just part of the growing up process. That's what kids do. Young children, even through adolescence, even adults, we unfortunately, we still do this. We will ridicule people for various things. Even the coolest person here was ridiculed for something. I mean, like for me, people talking about, you're so handsome, you're so... Got old hearing it, but I'm ridiculed for it. And so, but there was always something that each of us experienced. Let me, with that in mind, ask you this. Think back to some of the things that people said to you, that they made fun of you for. What stung or what hurt the most? Now, I believe in a general way, I can answer that question for all of us. The things that had the most truth in them. For example, if another classmate said to you, "Oh, you're just dumb," but if you look at your report card and it says straight A's, who cares? I'm not dumb. Look at my report card. There's Exhibit A, all A's. I'm not dumb. So that kind of goes off you like water off of a duck's back. What really stings, though, is when they say things that have a measure of truth in them. So if, for example, as a child you wore glasses and other kids called you Four Eyes, that hurt because there was a measure of truth in it. Or maybe when you were losing teeth and getting your adult teeth, and because of that your front teeth stuck out a little bit, and if they called you Beaver or nicknamed you Buck, that hurt, didn't it? Why? Because there was a measure of truth in it. What stings the most is that which has a measure of truth. Now, with that in mind, think what Peter is talking about. If someone harasses you, if someone insults you, if someone derides you or slights you or persecutes you in any way for your stand for Christ, they do so with the intention of hurting you, of stinging you, for that to resonate in your mind as having a measure of truth. And Peter's point is this: don't let it sting you. Let it come to you as a great encouragement because there's truth in it. Let it come to you as a pat on the back that, listen, I'm so serious about my commitment to Christ, and I'm so serious about following His example that they're making fun of me for that. That's not a bad thing, that's a good thing. As Joseph said back in the Old Testament, what you meant for evil, God meant for good. What people are meaning for evil against you, to insult you, to hurt you, to discourage you, God means that for good. It's a litmus test of showing you, listen, you're doing exactly what you ought to be doing. That you are living a life that's markedly different because you are patterning yourself after a different example. Our lives ought to be different because we're following a different model. But he communicates another reason, and that's because we've wasted enough opportunity. We've wasted enough opportunity. In verse 2, he says that we should no longer live the rest of our time in the flesh, which is to say that however much more time we have on this earth, the rest of our lives, we should not live that time according to or for the lusts of men, but for the will of God. That's pretty straightforward. He's saying that you shouldn't spend the rest of your life, if you're a follower of Jesus, you ought not spend the rest of your time just following the most basic carnal instincts that we have, doing what everybody else is doing. Instead, pursue living and meting out the will of God in your life. But then he follows that by saying in verse 3, this is the reason. Because we spent enough of our past lifetime in doing the will of the Gentiles. Now, when Peter uses the word Gentile there, he's not trying to draw a distinction between those that are Jewish and non-Jew. He's talking about those that are part of the family of God and those that are not. He's trying to draw a distinction between those that are saved and those that are lost, those that are saved and those that are not. He's saying that we have spent enough of our past lifetime doing the will of lost people. Now, when he's talking about our past lifetime, he's talking about the time before we began a relationship with Christ, before we started following Him. We spent enough of our time before we came to know Christ doing what everybody else was doing, and he begins to describe things. Lewdness, lusts, drunkenness, revelries, drinking parties, abominable idolatries. And so all sorts of amoral and immoral behavior, bad decisions, addictions, all sorts of things that we have been patterning ourselves after. Some of you in reading these words can recognize that Peter's not talking about an abstract illustration. Maybe that's a reflection of your story. And over the years, I've had scores of people describe what it was like for them before they came to know Jesus, making slews of bad decisions. For some, it was immoral behavior that they were trapped in. For others, it was addictions, whether to drugs or to alcohol. But when they came to know Jesus, there was this dramatic transformation in their life, and their life was completely different. Jesus made this enormous change in their life, and when you read Peter's words, when he talks about spending or having spent enough of your past life doing that stuff, you say, that's me. I've absolutely wasted entirely enough time doing all that junk. And because of that, maybe it is that you feel a real measure of regret, a real measure of guilt over that. I remember years ago going with the youth from our former church to Centrifuge one summer, and in a small group time, you had youth and adults from various different churches broken down into these small groups. And the leader of this particular group started with a question. He asked everybody, if you had 3 wishes, what would they be? Go ahead and write them down. And so I'm sitting there thinking, okay, if I had 3 wishes, and anytime I play that game, my first wish is what? More wishes. Thank you. Those of us who are smart, that's what you want, more wishes. Anyway, so I'm not thinking especially spiritual. I just want more wishes. And so at this point, once everybody's responded, but they begin going around the room and sharing. And I remember there was this one adult, and he said, I couldn't come up really with 3. He said, but this is my greatest wish. He said, I wish I came to know the Lord earlier. I wish I came to know the Lord earlier, because I feel like I wasted so much time doing dumb stuff, so much time not living for Him that I wish I could go back and live for Him. And what Peter is describing absolutely reflects the sentiment of his heart. Man, I wasted so much time. And some of you can say, that's me. That's me. Wasted so much time. And so because of that, or in view of that, man, I need to be living in such a way that God's using my life to count. I'm going to be serious about following Him. My life is going to be different because I've wasted so much time before I came to know Him. But then there's another group, a group of which I'm a part of. And it's not that Christ rescued you from the gutter. It wasn't out of necessarily a broken home or broken relationships. It wasn't out of the gutter of addiction. It wasn't out of immoral behavior that God rescued you. Maybe it was like me, that you had grown up in church, grown up exposed to the claims of Jesus and the truth of the Bible, and at a fairly early age you made a decision to begin to walk with Jesus, to become one of His followers. And you read these words, and it's easy to say, well, that doesn't have anything to do with me. I came to know the Lord at an early age. But I believe for us, there's a different layer of application, which is this. If you came to know the Lord at an early age, if you've had so much more time to follow Him and live for Him as compared to others, why have you spent so much of that time acting like a lost person? Why is it that so much time has spent living in such a way where the only thing that distinguishes you and your life from anybody that says they're not a follower of Jesus is where you spend your time on Sunday mornings? There's nothing else different. How you entertain yourself, how you spend money, how you raise your children, what it is that you talk about in personal conversations, what it is that you find funny, how it is that you use money, how it is that you use time, how you use all these things. There is no difference from the average lost person. Peter's words, I believe, come to us as a strong kick in the rear end. Why have you wasted so much time? You came to know the Lord at an early age, and God could have used your life to great effect. But He's not, because there's been so little difference. Again, the point is this: our lives as followers of Jesus ought to be markedly different. And they ought to be different because we've wasted enough time, whether that was because we came to know the Lord at an early age and didn't live for Him as we could have or should have, or maybe because we came to know the Lord much later in life. We have wasted enough opportunity, and because we understand that, our lives ought to be markedly different. But then he communicates a final reason, and that our lives ought to be different because our task is consequential. Our task is consequential. In verse 4, after having, at the end of verse 3, described all these various scenarios and painting a picture of what lost people's lives look like, he says, in regard to these, they, which is those that are outside of Christ, they think it's strange that you do not run with them. They look at you, if you're trying to live for Jesus, and they look at you and they think, why aren't you doing this stuff? Why aren't you watching the same shows? Why is it that you're not living together outside of marriage? Why is it that you're keeping yourself for marriage? Why is it that you're not ingesting these chemicals? Why is it that you're not doing things just like us? And he's saying that those outside of Christ, at first, they'll look at you strange. They'll think that we are a funny lot. But what begins initially as an oddity, the heat begins to get turned up, because he says, at the end of verse 4, they begin to speak evil of you. And so it goes from, well, that's kind of strange, that's kind of odd, and increasingly it becomes and gets to the point where they begin to turn the heat up and speak evil of you to make life more difficult for you. This is how they're going to act. But he says in verse 5, he says, they will give an account to him who is ready to judge the living and the dead. Lest we find ourselves forgetting, we need to remind ourselves of a very simple yet altogether important reality. Every person will stand before the Lord. Everyone will stand before the Lord. And when you stand, when anyone stands before the Lord, the question is not going to be how much work did you do, how much did you give, how much did you help, how much did you teach, or anything else. Ultimately, the defining question is going to be this: what did you do with Jesus? What did you do with Jesus? Peter's saying, listen, our lives ought to be so markedly different because we know that everyone is going to stand before the Lord. And they're going to stand before the Lord to give an account for what they did with Jesus, and they've got to know that answer. Just recently, Caroline was talking to someone that both of us know. She's an ordained Presbyterian minister, among other things, responsible for shepherding the youth at her church, where she's on staff. And in the conversation with Caroline, she described how she has a sister who married a Muslim. And I think that registered with her, but it was of little consequence. And then she said recently that her sister, who had the same upbringing as she did, the same exposure to their church as she did, that the family was celebrating Ramadan and had the children dressed in traditional Islamic garb. And she said, seeing that, it bothered me. But then she immediately followed it by saying this: but you know, I don't know why it bothered me. And then Caroline said this, or asked her the question, well, do you think that they're going to go to heaven? And her answer was, Well, yeah, I don't think it would be fair for God to do otherwise. And then Caroline asked this: what was the point then of Jesus coming and dying? And the answer was this: I don't know. I don't know. That is a weighty, burdensome thought, that not only is she going to stand before the Lord, but all of those whose hearts she's responsible for shepherding, they're not going to know the answer to that. What did you do with Jesus? Peter's saying, listen, the stakes are high. We're talking about things of real consequence. We're not talking about who wins the American Idol or who wins The Voice or who wins the World Series or what the weather's. We're talking about where people spend all of eternity, because they're going to stand before the Lord, and it's going to be of the singular question: what did you do with Jesus? And if you're a follower of His, your life ought to be so different that we recognize that, and that we're communicating to people the truth of the hope that's within us. But for too many of us, it's not the case. The difference is where we spend our Sunday mornings. Maybe the fact that we say the blessing. Peter's saying that it ought to be awfully different, because we're going to stand before the Lord. He said, for this reason, this message, this truth was preached to those who are dead. And that's not communicating there, I believe it's in verse 6, that people after they die get a second opportunity. Rather, he's saying that even those who have died, they've been able to be exposed to the claims of God and the truth of His existence. Everyone will have had exposure to the truth. And because of that, they're going to stand to give an account. He says it may be for some of you that you wind up getting judged by men in this life. They ridicule you. They make life difficult for you because of your commitment to Jesus. But notice how he ends verse 6. But we live according to God in the Spirit. What they mean for evil, God means for good. The stakes are great, and because of that, our lives ought to be markedly different. Today is, August the 17th. So August is essentially, it's more than halfway over. And I guess it's next week that Guilford County schools start back. And that kind of symbolizes, at the very least, the end of summer. And so fall is going to soon be upon us. And leaves will begin to change color. And we'll start eating nothing but pumpkins for a few months. And so all these things happen in the fall. But among the things that generally consistently happens in the fall is that car manufacturers come out with their new models. I don't know if you've paid attention. It's generally September, October when they do that. I had read recently, for example, the Toyota Camry is coming out with a completely new redesign. Sometimes what they do is they just change the headlights or the tail lights, or they do something with the tailgate. They put some more gizmos on the interior. But then sometimes, like this new Camry, it's a complete body design, very different inside and out. And I was thinking about that and wondered this: why do car companies do that? Why don't they just make the Camry, kind of like Henry Ford did, and said, here's the car, like it, lump it, here it is? Why don't they just say, here's the Camry, if you want that this is what it looks like, and this is what it's going to look like? Why doesn't Ford say, this is the F-150, you buy this, and 20 years from now, it's still going to look like this? Why don't they just make this car and this truck and say, that's what it's like? Why do every few years they keep coming out with these changes? Well, I think the answer is very simple, and you probably already figured out the answer to it. And that's because these car manufacturers want you to look at these new models, these new designs, and see that's different, very different from what you have. Yeah, it may say Camry, it may say Taurus, it may say whatever still on the back, just like your car does, but it looks completely different. They understand, these manufacturers, that people look for something and are attracted by things that are different. One of the reasons that I believe the Christian church has been unfortunately so ineffective at reaching people for Jesus is that because too often, all too often, we have lives and live lives that are not very different. The only thing that the world sees too many times is a difference in name, a technical distinction. You say you are a Christian, and that's the only difference that they see. You're a Christian, so what? You do things just like me. What this area needs, what our country needs, what this world needs, and quite frankly, what God expects is to have His followers to live like and behave like His followers. And when that happens, our lives will be so markedly different that in addition to our verbal expressions of faith, people can see the difference. And like that new car, begin to think, you know what? I'd like to experience that myself. Some will ridicule, some will mock, but others will see and come to discover that God's done something significant in our lives, and they decide that they want to experience it as well. Very simply stated, our lives collectively, your life individually, if you profess to be a follower of Jesus, ought to be markedly different. Because you've got a different example, a different model that you're following, because you've wasted enough time and because the stakes are high. The task is consequential. If that is true, and with all of my heart I believe it is, my question very simply then is this: how much different are you? Won't you bow your heads with me? You have probably heard someone pose this hypothetical in the past. But if you were to be indicted by a grand jury and to be tried by a jury of your peers for being a follower of Jesus, would there be enough evidence to convict? Would there be a difference that they could point to? Hopefully you recognize that there should be, there ought to be. But for too many of us, if we're honest before God, there hasn't been. And maybe how God has spoken to you through the truth of His Word today is very simply this: enough time has been wasted. The stakes are high. People's lives, people's eternal destinations are on the line. It's time to start living different. I can't tell you exactly, but I believe that the Lord, through the power of His Spirit, is showing you in your life and in your heart, your behaviors, your speech, your actions, your habits, there's some things that need to change. As He's shown you that, it's not so that you could say, well, that's nice. It's so that you could say, that's what He wants me to do, and I'm going to make that decision. I'm going to make that change. You've got a time now, an opportunity, an invitation to make that decision. And maybe you'd like to fortify that decision or to commit that decision before the Lord by kneeling at this altar. In just a moment, we're going to stand and sing, but if God's speaking to your heart, why don't you just leave now where you are? You can come and already just talk to Him. Just be honest with Him. Tell Him where you are. Tell Him where you recognize He wants you to be. Pray for the guidance and the courage to get there. For others that have been here this morning and you've seen through symbols this act of baptism and through symbols this change that Jesus can make in a person's life, you recognize, you know what, I don't know that I have that. I don't know that I've experienced that. Maybe you're a church member. Maybe you've been baptized, but in your heart you recognize you're not yet one of His followers. If that's you, during this time of invitation, will you just come, share that with me? Let me pray with you and begin a conversation with you so that you can come to know Him, come to follow Him, experience the difference that He can make, and begin to live a life that's markedly different. Perhaps the decision God's prompting you to make is to become a part of this church family. The simple truth is that He's spoken. He's spoken because there's something He wants you to do. The question is, will you do it? Father, we're grateful to You for the truth of Your Word. We're grateful that You always speak. I pray, Lord, just as You are faithful in speaking, that we will be faithful to respond. We commit this time of invitation to You in Jesus' name. Amen. I'm going to ask if you